This is live from Lodi Garden, a conversation about the world, sitting in a 15th century garden in New Delhi, the capital of India. Your host is the award-winning historian, Hindul Sengupta.
This is live from Lodi Garden. I'm Hindul Sengupta. We are back, of course, amid the tombs of the Lodi kings and, of course, this beautiful garden at the heart of New Delhi. My guest today is a bit of a unique person. Debuttam Toshi Bose, or Toshi as most of his friends know him as. He is India's most prominent art lawyer with a practice that spans around the world, from New York to Calcutta, from New Delhi to Oxford, to Hong Kong, to Singapore. He helps people buy art properly, so to speak. And Debuttam Bose is with me today. And the first question I want to ask him, after welcoming him to live at Lodi Garden, is, Debuttam, should King Charles give back the Kohinoor?
Good morning, Hindul. Great to be here. Wonderful. And the shortest answer you will get from me, because usually lawyers love to give long-winded answer, is yes, absolutely. Question of this has been open-ended for such a long time. And I think art diplomacy really is very much in the flavor, and particularly with relations internationally, India and the world. And Britain, 21st century, there is absolutely no room for keeping stolen objects or assisting with illicit trade in art, however you want to call it. But as a gesture of goodwill, absolutely.
I want to ask you, Debuttam, let's talk about the Kohinoor first. The Kohinoor has become a sort of an emblem to this question, right? Because it's not, of course, only about colonial loot from India. This is about across the erstwhile colonial world. The Benin bronzes, for instance, right? Consistently loot that is found with art dealers in New York, right? In different museums in America and other parts of the world. The volume, the sheer volume, talk to us a little bit about the sheer volume of art that went away from parts of Asia, from Africa, and other parts of the once colonial ruled world to the West. Has there ever been a real assessment of how much went away?
You're absolutely right. And the amounts and the volume and the value is just staggering. And there has never been an assessment made because we just don't know. So just very recently, one such dealer from New York who was in jail in Chennai, he got sentenced to 10 years. And this is somebody called Subhash Kapoor, and I would request audience to look him up. And he had a gallery in Manhattan, in Madison, called The Art of the Past. Absolutely. Called The Art of the Past. And he was one of those dealers who, when it came to collectors from across the world, not just in the US, not just in New York or in the West Coast, all the top museums, from the Met to the National Gallery in Australia to galleries in Singapore, he's made sure the best of their prized works were handled, and it came through him. And every single work that he handled they're all stolen works, temple loots. And I would recommend a wonderful book called The Idol Thief by Vijay Kumar, who has written extensively about this. And also another person, he's an investigative journalist called Jason Fletch, who wrote this book, Chasing Aphrodite. And he's actually done a lot of work in this area, who helped nab these looters. But the sheer value and the volume is just staggering, because this has been going on for over half a century and more.
You were telling us about Subhash Kapoor, who had a gallery close to the Met in New York, and of course, had his tentacles across India, including in Delhi.
Yes, absolutely. And I don't know if you know the backstory of how this came about. So Subhash Kapoor operated in, as you said, in different jurisdictions, including London. And how they would do is very interesting. So they would work closely with, essentially traffickers who would, he would travel around, and he's made a written confession. So it's public knowledge that they would travel around South India and they would go to temples which are not used, and these traffickers would then get the idol or the bronzes. So, for example, if you look at the Nataraja, which was returned from Australia, and our Prime Minister, this was a great, a soft diplomacy, art diplomacy, where Australia returned quite rightly the Chola bronze. So Subhash Kapoor would travel to South India. They have found images of this particular piece, which was in a room, and they recovered that image in his computer back in Manhattan. This gallery used to be called the Art of the Past. Now, what would happen is they would doctor fake history documents, so what we call provenance letters, and they would create a complete fake origin, fake papers, fake collectors. And then somebody like him would legitimize, they would even work with art restorers, and an unsuspecting buyer would then find this an incredible piece. And usually what they would do is they would show that there is a UNESCO convention, a soft law, which states that, if there are objects that has come out of India or of any other country pre-1970, that's more or less okay. It becomes trickier post-1970. So they would, again, doctor documents stating they're 1968, in the 60s. And he did all of that. And then an unsuspecting museum or a collector would fall for this. But the sad part is that, and for this particular piece, the Chola bronze in question, which was returned back to India, this had a price tag of $5 million. Now, that's a staggering amount of money. And you would expect that any institution would spend some time and money on what we call in the legal parlance due diligence. As an art lawyer, that's part of my job, is to investigate and showcase that these are serious question marks. Because clearly in this case, the big question mark was, how did it leave India? The provenance, paperwork, authentication, all of that can be manufactured. And it is all the time, consistently. I see that in my trade. But the big question is, how does it leave India? Because if that's a big question mark, then the rest of the charade just falls through. So Subhash Kapoor is just the tip of the iceberg. This started from the days of Doris Wiener, who was, again, a Manhattan dealer, a very well-known, very established, very reputed. And her daughter, Nancy Wiener, again, has been indicted. She made public statements that, again, how she did exactly the same thing. Manufacture provenance, deal in looted, stolen artifacts, and then sell it to the highest bidder. And again, sadly, it was the National Gallery in Australia who were the victims.
Tell us, Devottam, one of the things that has always intrigued me is, as an art lawyer, like you said, it's your job to try and find these things out for your clients, right? And help them get the right pieces, presumably at the right price, with the right authenticity. What kind of legal questions are increasingly arising in your line of work because of this entire question of colonial loot, loot in general. Subhash Kapoor was not part of colonial India; he was doing it in contemporary India, but especially about colonial material, because one part of it is the erstwhile colonial countries, whether it's France or the United Kingdom, various other countries in Europe. It's also royal families, isn't it? We began this conversation talking about whether King Charles should agree to give back the Kohinoor, and the newspapers were full of on only a few weeks ago the question on whether the Queen would wear Camilla would wear the Kohinoor at the coronation of King Charles next year. So these questions are so intertwined, and I wonder what you think about them. What about royal families? Should they offer to return much of the material that they have, especially if it's shown that these materials weren't gifted, so to speak, they were taken by force?
Absolutely, and it also depends on civil society and the dialogue. It is so important that we educate the people first in terms of what really happened and why it happened and what really were the options to the victims or the country. Did they have any say in any choice? People make that case that, oh, these were gifts. But in what context were they gifts? Kohinoor, of course, people who've read about the Kohinoor would know the background about, was it really a gift to the British Royal? I think, a case in point right now is, Charles III is facing pressure to return the sacred tablet, which is a symbolic representing the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia. And what is astonishing is that the Westminster Abbey is directly under the monarch's jurisdiction, and yet, they refuse to return the Holy Tablet. And we have in record the Archbishop of Canterbury going to say that he's told the newspaper that he's astonished and saddened that the Westminster Abbey is refusing to return a sacred tablet to Ethiopia. And for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, this is a holy tablet that symbolically represents the Ark of the Covenant. Now, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And I mean, we've had the British Museum. They recently had a big event, and the chair of the museum goes on to say that in terms of we should be very careful that our generation doesn't go and return everything that was collected over generation. Now, that mindset is very difficult because that doesn't take into context what happened with colonial loot, the transference, the culture, the people's own connection with culture. And I think these are conversations that need to happen, at least to begin with. Repatriation, the legal complex process, the diplomacy that works, all of that can follow. But it's so important that conversation takes place, people talk about it openly, and not necessarily be a blame game, but understand that these have really important connotations for both countries.
I want to talk to you a little bit about, you mentioned Ethiopia. There's also the Benin bronzes, and many other artifacts from Africa, right? India, of course, there are tons and tons of, countless artifacts that were moved away from India and are sprinkled around the world. Most of it, a large amount of it, if not most of it, illegally, during the colonial era, then later stolen, and so on and so forth. At a time when the world is really discussing decolonization, what is the impact this kind of return of artifacts could have? Could it make our conversation better? Could it make relations healthier? Could it help us, reach? For instance, could Britain? I have often argued that Britain and India should, build a relationship away from the shadow of colonialism, because it's been 75 years and so on and so forth, right? Could the return of the Kohinoor, for instance, and other things begin a sort of post-colonial relationship, which is healthy, which is positive, between two large democracies, two large economies, and make their cooperation better?
I couldn't agree with you more. Absolutely. And interestingly enough, it's actually Germany who's leading in terms of the whole dialogue between returning the Benin bronzes, and also Glasgow has taken an initiative, and we've had ministers and cultural ministry from Nigeria who have travelled. So when we look at Britain and modern Britain, and of course, they've in the paper and at least representatively, we have had people of Indian origin, people of South Asian origin, people of African descent who've taken very senior positions. And we have a prime minister whose name is Rishi Sunak. I mean, it doesn't get more in terms of ethnicity wise connect. And, right now we have an important trade agreement that is taking place between the United Kingdom and India. And notwithstanding the colonial past, I absolutely agree that there can be so much done which is it's forward looking as opposed to looking backwards. And I think art and culture can truly pave the way. And I think it has happened, but at an ad hoc level. But I think at a policy level, if leaders, particularly from Britain, take that initiative, I think that can make a huge difference. Because at the end of the day, we have the ex-Chancellor of Britain, George Osborne, who goes on to say that don't expect us to be passive in the face of restitution. Now, that kind of talk is not helpful, right? It's talked about, and he's mentioned that we hear the voices calling for restitution, but creating this global British museum was the dedicated work of many generations. Dismantling it must not become the careless act of a single generation. Osborne added he believed international courts were on the museum's side. The law prevents it, he later said, referring to the British Museum's Act of 1963, which prohibits act of restitution. Now, I think that and clinging on to that kind of a rhetoric is not helpful.
No, it isn't, because what George Osborne is talking about. I mean, it's just so interesting. It's that cabinet of curiosities that the white man went to bring together, isn't it? I mean,
Absolutely.
The Ashmolean in Oxford, this was created out of such a cabinet of curiosities, right? They would go around the world, they would gather these sort of, curiosities, so to speak, and they would come back to their home district and create these sort of, mini personal museums, the cabinet of curiosities. And that collection, from which, a large part of the Ashmolean sort of begins from there, is still there, in Oxford. And I am not sure, and I want to ask you this, I'm not sure the act of collecting such cabinets of curiosities should be looked at by erstwhile colonial powers, or especially in the white man's world, so to speak, as something that they achieved. Because clearly other parts of the world see this as treasures that were taken away. Certainly this is true in South Asia, in India, and certainly this is true in Africa.
Absolutely, across the world. And interestingly enough, we have an artist, Victor Eckenholm, who mentions that colonial history told by British historian is a glorification of inhuman conquest. And at one length, that is absolutely true. But how do you move away from that?
Sure, and build a post-colonial conversation.
Yes.
And you think returning some of these artworks would enable us to move away from the shadow of colonialism and build a post-colonial conversation, which would be between modern economies who want to trade with one another, who want to engage with one another without the burden of colonialism.
Absolutely. And I think, again, Nigerian artist, he made this point, and I think I absolutely endorse this, because the dialogue is very important. The recognition is very important, not to brush it away. And not to also say that, we should be steeped with guilt. That's also not the point. The point is, how do you engage? How do you bring communities together? How do you encourage future generation of young art historians and art lawyers to work in this area? and ultimately bring countries closer. Because if anything, the pandemic has taught us that how interlinked we are. And as we face, a population which has huge ramification when it comes to environment, the whole ecosystem, the survival of ecosystem, communities having closer dialogue, understanding our rich cultural heritage and what can be done together, that becomes very, very important.
I want to conclude, Devottam, by asking you to talk a little bit about your own work. In a sense, you go around the world. Like I said in the beginning of the program, whether it's Somerville College at Oxford or New York, or your practice in London, in Calcutta, in Singapore, in Delhi, of course, you have a global practice of helping, people collect art, but legally, and helping them stay away from pitfalls that we've been discussing in the course of our conversation. Tell us about one of your most interesting cases, so to speak, which fascinated and intrigued you. Were you able to, help somebody who may have otherwise bought something of a dubious provenance? Tell us a little bit about your most interesting case.
Yes, I have a niche practice, and you rightly said, it's a global practice. So art is it's a big industry. It's globally it's worth over $60 billion, and Indian art is catching up. And particularly as Indians have done so well abroad, be it in the US, be it in UK or Europe, Middle East, or in Southeast Asia, as they've done well, they buy their own art. But as a result, the issues of fakes and forgeries become a problem area. And of course, stolen works of art, but that's existed for a very long time. And my role is very much as an independent advisor who assists clients when they're looking to buy or when they're looking to sell so that they get the best value, or also when they want to commission artists who are living and make sure everything works out and they get paid the market value. In terms of, I've been very lucky and fortunate to have a great team who assists me. But recently we worked on assisting a collector who's based in the US. I won't mention the name in which city, but there's a very important museum. And this particular collector loves to buy works of art and then eventually donate it to the museum. And that's a tradition in the US, and that's how museums also fund their collection. And in India, again, a family in New Delhi who, again, became very successful in the business of pharmaceuticals and hospitals, etc. I would name them again, went on to have an incredible collection. But then, of course, they got into a number of problems in terms of corporate fraud, and their assets were frozen, particularly personal assets. And as I had mentioned, that art is seen as an asset class, and you can sell art and raise a lot of money under the radar privately. So we had both Delhi High Court judgments, Supreme Court judgments, and that stating that they couldn't sell their personal assets. And lo and behold, they had created a company, and through that company, they were selling these prized artworks, their collection on the side. Now, from a lawyer, this itself is problematic because what we call it is they have imperfect title. That means anybody later on can come and claim this, that you do not have the legal title to possess this. So my role was threefold: one, to investigate, then to understand, and then advise my clients, saying that they shouldn't go through this purchase. Not particularly because they would have an imperfect title, because I also knew that they would be donating to a museum, and that will create a lot of problems. So that's just one example, but there are so many which has multi-jurisdictional connotation.
Fascinating. Devottam Bose, thanks very much for agreeing to sit down with me
Pleasure.
to have this conversation. May your practice flourish. And if
Thank
the
you.
Kohinoor ever comes back to India, you and I will return to Lodi Garden for another conversation.
Yes, and thank you so much, Indol. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Debuttam. Thank you very much.
You were listening to Live from Lodi Garden with Hindul Sengupta. This is a Global Order presentation, edited and produced by Koteshwar Rao and directed by Rishi Suri.